Hey, Kiara. Give me a minute. I have a PowerPoint that I have not uploaded yet. And so I will get that up for you. All right, slides on conservation are on Moodle for your use. I'm working on your literature summaries from Buckley and Huey. Should have them out to you later on today. We can talk about those at the beginning of class. On tomorrow, if you wish, we'll be in class discussion about the Miller et al. Paper on Friday. Tomorrow in lab, come prepared to get wet. We will be in pond, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we are going through conservation, because that particular pond represents kind of a case study in conservation. So we'll talk briefly about that as well today. So here we are at the end of herpetology class. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So the last chapter of your textbook deals with conservation. And I think it's an important thing to talk about for a variety of reasons. We would probably talk about conservation at the end of a course on mammalogy or entomology or ornithology or any of the ologies that deal with major taxonomic groups. So basically the goal for today is I just want you to be conversant, fluent in the kinds of primary conservation challenges that face amphibians and reptiles in the 21st century. When we talk about conservation, in many cases, the conservation challenges for any group of organisms are common, but there are a couple of challenges that face amphibians and reptiles more than other groups. And then, for example, there are conservation challenges associated with birds that are different from those of amphibians and reptiles. So in many cases, these general classifications of conservation threats are commonplace and affect all organisms, but they don't necessarily affect all organisms equally. So here they are, essentially. Land use, land change. Sometimes it's shorthanded in the literature as LULAC. So if you ever see LULAC in something you're reading, you'll know that they're referring to land use, land change. Disease, global climate change, pollution, introduced species, and human exploitation. So exploitation of the organisms by human beings. And all of these influence virtually every taxonomic group that you could think of, but there are some things that tend to influence amphibians and reptiles more. One thing that tends to be more prevalent in amphibians in particular, but also in reptiles, is the prevalence of diseases that are an emerging conservation threat. Global climate change is more important perhaps for amphibians and reptiles than other groups because they are ectotherms. Pollution has influenced a lot of species in the past, but because once again, amphibians spend a part of their life cycle associated with water, any waterborne contaminants are going to affect them more than, for example, being reptiles are not affected by that as much. And then introduced species tend to have some significant impacts on, once again, amphibian species, but also reptile species. And in some cases, there are reptile species themselves that are introduced species that cause problems. So these four in the middle are possibly, arguably, a little more of an issue for amphibians or reptiles than they are for perhaps mammals or perhaps birds. Pollution used to be a problem with birds because we used to use a type of insecticide commonly in agriculture that disrupted calcium mobilization to eggs, and they would create eggs that were thin-shelled, and then when they would go to incubate the eggs, they would gently plop themselves down on the eggs, and because the eggshells were thin, they would crack the eggs, and as a result, that basically shut off reproduction. And since then, we've gotten rid of those pollutants, those insecticides, and replaced them with other insecticides. And so that particular pollution problem with birds has been solved, but then it's led to other problems, like some of these pesticides are endocrine disruptors, and we've talked about endocrine disruptors in the past. So we'll just kind of walk through these in sequence. So what we mean when we talk about land use, land change is this. So this is an image that I copied off of Google Earth. This is in the state of Rondônia, which is in South America. It's in Western Brazil. And what you can see here is a road network that has been cut into the jungle in Rondônia. And you can see that there are major roads that have been cut into the jungle, but then there are also secondary roads. And so you see these linear strips basically radiating at 90-degree angles from the roads that are in yellow here. Well, those represent secondary roads that are not mapped on Google Earth. And you can see that the deforestation that is occurring around those roads is basically removing the green, which is extant forest. And you can see along this road here, you can see that this road going east-west extends from this road going north and south, and it's got this kind of feathered appearance such that the little secondary roads to either side are wider where you're close to the primary road than further away from the primary road as you get further and further down this east-west running road. So roads encroach upon habitat. They make habitat accessible to human beings. And so this was 1984, this is 1994, this is 2004, this is 2014, and this is 2020. And so you can basically see that because of the presence of this road network, human beings have gained access to a patch of forest that they have not had access to in the past. And as a result, where they have that access, they have basically deforested those areas and converted them into agriculture. And so deforestation is just one example of land use, land change that can negatively impact any group of organisms, but can impact amphibians and reptiles as well. You will also notice that this road here is a recent road. It appears on Google Earth because I just asked it to plot roads, and it plots roads that are in existence regardless of their recency. But you can see that there isn't much encroachment around that road because that presumably is a relatively recent addition to the road system. And you can go on Google Earth and look at the historical imagery, and virtually any place on the planet you can see these similar patterns. The best thing you can do to decrease habitat destruction is you can just not build roads there. So now, can you guys see Google Earth?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go over here to Peru. I lived in Peru for a while, and we were based out of a town called Pucallpa, which is right here in kind of the center of Peru. And we worked in the jungles, basically north and south of Pucallpa along the Ucayali River. The Ucayali River is a river that is a tributary of the Amazon River. Outside of Iquitos, the Ucayali comes into contact with the Marañón, and at that point they form the Rio Amazonas, and then from that point on you have the Amazon River, and the Amazon River here at Manaus makes contact with the Rio Negro, which is a river that flows primarily through lowland forest, which is why it's black in color, because it picks up the tannins from the leaves. The Amazon River at this point is mainly coming out of the Andes, and so it's filled with all of the sediment. And right here at Manaus, you can see these two rivers joining, and you can see their waters mixing. So you can see the water from the Amazon and the water from the Rio Negro coming together, and then over a period of time they slowly mix until way downstream it's kind of just this muddy river again. But when I lived in Peru, and it's still largely true to this day, the Ucayali River was a significant enough barrier to human dispersal that you'll see that all of these roads come down to the roads are in yellow. They come down to the Ucayali and they stop. They come down to the Ucayali River and they stop. They come down, in this case, to the Marañón and stop. And so the eastern portion of Peru is basically roadless. And if you zoom in on Pucallpa, you can see that this is 2020 imagery. You can see all of this land use change that has happened on this side of the river, because there's this highway, this major highway that goes from Pucallpa to Lima, the capital city. And as a result, there are roads that branch off of that. And you can see, if you look along these roads, you can see these horizontal strips, which are then due to other smaller roads being cut into the jungle. And anytime you get to a section of jungle that is inaccessible by road, you begin to see forest that is unimpacted. But of course, here's a little town that is connected by this road, and the river that is around there is easily travelable, so that along the river you can start to see land use change. Go back to Pucallpa, the road ends at the river, and you can see some development going on out in the jungles away from here. But the further away you get from Pucallpa, the less development and land use change you see. And the other advantageous thing about this is that in terms of geopolitics, you can see out here in Western Brazil, there's a lot of land use change. Once again, as a result of Brazil building roads out to the western frontier, but these roads go up to the Peruvian border and stop. And it's because there's not international cooperation between the two countries that allows them to continue building this road into Peru, gaining access to, Peru doesn't want Brazil gaining access to eastern Peruvian forest resources. And so all these roads come right up to the border and stop. As a matter of fact, I exited, I was in this section of Peru, and there's an Air Force base out here called Breu. And then closer to the border, there's an army outpost. And on both sides of the border, Brazil has a fort on one side of the border, and Peru has a fort on the other side of the border. And they just sit there and watch one another. And the only way you can get to that port is by air, coming from Pucallpa. You can fly there and land on this little grass strip. So as long as this area stays stays roadless, the odds of it being developed like sections of Brazil have been developed are better. But you can see all throughout Brazil, Brazil has done a very good job of expanding its road network. And whenever you see roads coming in, you begin to see deforestation happening. So land use land change is significant. If you have a species that is reliant upon forests, then it's not going to survive well in places that have been converted to agriculture. If you have species that are reliant upon, prairie landscapes, and those have been plowed under for agriculture, once again, you're not going to see those species doing particularly well. Some species adjust pretty well to disturbance. So for example, if you go to K-State and walk around their campus during the warmer times of the year, you will see that all over the campus of Kansas State in Manhattan, you will see Great Plains skinks running around. I was shocked and surprised. Growing up in Texas, we have Great Plains skinks, but they're not super common, even in places where they occur. And yet it's the most common amphibian or reptile that you will see on a campus in the middle of a town at K-State. But not all organisms respond well to those kinds of land use changes. Disease, big chunk of your book talks about chytrid fungus. There are two types of chytrid fungi. One type influences anurans. There is another species that influences salamanders. This is a fungal disease, and basically it can interfere with development by basically encysting itself in places. And so this is kind of the life cycle of the fungus. So you have the fungus growing on the skin of the animal. It disrupts the ability of the animal to regulate water balance, essentially. And so this fungus is found on the skin of frogs and salamanders, which is why there is now a ban on the movement of virtually all frog and salamander species across state lines now. Because when you pick up a frog or a salamander that has a chytrid fungus in one part of its range, you bring it to another part of its range, it then is carrying these fungal spores. Those fungal spores get into the water, and then they go on to infect other amphibians in this new environment where there wasn't chytrid fungus before. So it's capable of being spread by humans, but it also is capable of just moving around naturally as organisms move around. This was a problem that was identified back in the late 90s, and so this is a relatively recent thing. Since it's become a problem, researchers, academic researchers, and also researchers at zoos have been tracking the chytrid fungus by doing genetics on the fungus to see how it's been transmitted. And you can see that chytrid fungus has been moving southward out of the United States through Mexico and into Panama. And as a result, this was probably 6 or 7 years ago, through research, a group of researchers at Zoo Atlanta were figuring out that chytrid was beginning to make its way through Panama, and there are a number of endemic species in Panama. And a guy that I know named Joe Mendelson, who is the curator of herps at Zoo Atlanta, got together a couple of friends and went down to Panama. And he's worked throughout the New World tropics, especially Central America, for a number of years. And he knew of certain species that were going to be at risk of extinction if somebody didn't remove them from the wild before the chytrid fungus arrived there. So he got a couple of his friends together. They flew to Panama. They went to these sites where they knew that these amphibians occurred. They gathered up a bunch of them, put them in ice chests, and brought them back alive to Zoo Atlanta. And they did this very quickly. They did this without permits. They did this without the permission of the government. They just basically went down, took the frogs, and brought them back. And kind of made international news because they violated a ton of treaties and a ton of regulations. It was against the law according to U.S. Fish and Wildlife regulations and laws on the international traffic of endangered species. It violated CITES treaties. They managed to not get in trouble because, like, the next year, the remaining natural populations of many of these species got wiped out by this chytrid fungus. And so they're now at the Atlanta Zoo. They're being bred in captivity with the hopes that someday, when someone figures out a way to reduce the impact of chytrid fungus on frogs and salamanders, they'll be able to reintroduce these animals back into their native environments. So, a little conservation airlift in action in that case. Climate change, we've already talked a lot about climate change when we were talking about temperature. We talked about climate change some when we were talking about water balance. This is a figure from your textbook, basically looking at cloud forests. So if you're in a mountainous region, air currents hit the mountain. As the air climbs, it cools. As it cools, the water condenses. And at the very tops of mountains, you have what are called cloud forests. And one of the things that happens as you go up a mountain is there is a layer, there's an elevation, an altitude, called the cloud condensation layer or level. And this is the altitude at which the air has cooled enough that these clouds begin to condense and they form mists or clouds in these cloud forests. And for example, they've been tracking this for decades now in Puerto Rico. And as the climate warms, what has happened is that the cloud condensation level that used to be at this level back in the 1970s is now a couple of hundred meters higher up the mountain in 2021. In Puerto Rico, there is a particular type of tree that is indicative of the forest type that occurs in cloud forest. And at the field station where I used to work, which is at about 350 meters, you can find old Palo Colorado trees, this species that lives in cloud forest. But those trees are very old. Most of them are dead or dying because of old age. And as a result, new Palo Colorado trees are not replacing them in those areas around the field station because the cloud condensation level is no longer occurring at that elevation. It occurs at a higher elevation. And if you go up to that higher elevation, you can find lots of Palo Colorado trees. So over time with global warming, as the entire environment warms, the environment at this elevation warms, and so cloud condensation doesn't occur until higher up. Well, if you're an amphibian that relies on that moist environment provided by those cloud forests, if you look at the number of dry days in January to May, which in this case is the wet season, which is also when amphibians are breeding, you find that as that increases, you get crashes in the anuran populations. So around each of these dry spells, number of dry days, where they peak, you generally find amphibian declines in terms of population numbers associated with those dry days. And eventually, it's going to drive the cloud condensation layer so high that clouds don't condense in those forests at all. And then at that point, it's going to be very difficult for frogs to breed. So this is just another example of the challenges that amphibians in particular face with climate change. We've already talked at length about some regulatory consequences of this, and so I won't belabor that. What's an example of pollution potentially endangering populations of frogs? that we've talked about in this class before. This is work done by Tyrone Hayes at Berkeley.
It was atrazine, like a pesticide, I think.
Yep. So we've talked about the pesticide atrazine. I mentioned that DDT caused a problem with birds and their ability to reproduce because of alterations to the calcium content of eggs. So you move away from DDT to other types of pesticides. And unfortunately, in the case of atrazine, atrazine is an endocrine disruptor. Remind me what an endocrine disruptor is.
It interrupts like the normal hormonal sequencing or sequence of an organism, which alters, in this case, I was talking about like sex development, but it can alter a lot of things.
Yeah, and so it basically disrupts the hormonal balance of a species. And in the case of atrazine, it essentially alters hormone production such that individuals that are genotypically male end up not growing into males because they lack the hormonal cues that prompt development into males. And so you have these frogs that are genotypically male that end up growing up to be females. And they're so female that they actually can produce offspring, which is one of the striking things about this system. Now, in this case, he's dealing with frogs that are also an introduced species. So you might not be all that worried about, declines in an introduced species due to this feminization of male frogs. But if it's happening in this introduced species of frog, it's probably happening in native groups of frogs as well, that you can't go in and do these types of experiments on because they're native. I was at the Missouri Academy of Sciences meeting 2 weekends ago, I guess, and there were 2 graduate students there presenting about microplastics, which are small, tiny plastic fragments that either come from the degradation of larger plastics, or we used to use microplastics in a lot of cosmetic products, and they've now been banned for quite some time now in the United States. But it was interesting because while they were presenting, one of them, while he was presenting a thing on microplastics, he showed a picture of a sea turtle ingesting a plastic bag, which is definitely a macroplastic, not a microplastic. So we have certain types of pollution like chemicals, but we also have just trash that then animals ingest. It causes blockages in their digestive system and can lead to death after prolonged periods of illness. So pollution of a variety of different types is problematic for animals. Sea turtles will oftentimes be feeding on jellyfish, and so when you see a plastic bag in the water, it kind of resembles a jellyfish, and they will go in and eat the plastic bag, thinking that they're eating a jellyfish. And so some groups, because of their foraging behavior, are more prone to problems from things like pollution than other groups are. Introduced species is a complication because introduced species can either create competition for native species, or they can actually be predators on those native species. And so in the mountains of the western United States, the Sierra Nevada mountains, there are all of these high elevation ponds that used to be the breeding area of some species of frogs that live at high elevations in these mountains. Over time, people have wanted to go to these ponds and fish, and so they've introduced fish into these ponds and lakes that previously were fishless. And the main result of this is that those fish are predators on frogs, both adult frogs and tadpoles. And as a result of this, that you've seen the introduction of trout, for example, lead to a decline in frog populations over time. The similar problem has happened with the introduction of bullfrogs into the Western United States, once again, mainly for growing for food. These bullfrogs are big enough that they can eat smaller species of frogs, and they also serve not only as a source of predation, but also a source of competition. The tiger salamander of the eastern United States has also been introduced into the Western United States, mainly as bait for fishing. And there is a California tiger salamander that is on the endangered species list. And one of the challenges of that particular situation is not only competition for resources, but also dilution of the genetics of the California tiger salamander. So as the new tiger salamander, the one from the east, has been introduced, it not only competes with the California tiger salamander, but can also interbreed with California tiger salamander, leading to these hybrids. And as a result, the gene pool that makes the California tiger salamander what it is being diluted by these introduced salamanders. Another classic case study for this is the introduction of the brown tree snake, Boiga irregularis. This is a Southeast Asian species, but it was only found on the mainland of Southeast Asia. It's sometimes referred to as one of the big-eyed snakes or cat-eyed snakes of that region. After World War II, when the United States was moving a bunch of military equipment out of Southeast Asia after the end of the war in the Pacific in World War II, some of these tanks and things that they were moving around had Boiga irregularis hitchhiked on them. Guam is a military base, a military outpost of the American government. When the tanks stopped over in Guam, these snakes hopped off, and then once they were there, they found themselves in a snake-free environment, and they then proceeded to eat their way through the entire island. And so they ate geckos, they ate anoles, they ate piranhids. They basically ate all of the bird species that live there. And these are all species that were endemic to Guam for the most part. They had evolved without predation pressure from snakes. And so when these snakes got there, they just kind of went crazy. And they ate the birds first, and then after the birds, they went for the herps. And at this point, if you go to a zoo, you will see in the bird area, you will oftentimes see a set of birds that are found in zoos that are once again the captive populations of these species that have largely gone extinct in the wild. In this case, because of an introduced reptile species. There are examples in the literature of this snake crawling in and into people's nurseries and biting and trying to consume infants, human infants. There are problems with farmers because as they've run out of native animals to eat, they've begun feeding on both household pets and also things like chickens that people raise for food. So in this case, a introduced reptile causing all sorts of problems on the island of Guam. And then I think the last thing here is just exploitation, people using amphibians or reptiles for, in many cases, food, but we also have other uses for amphibians or reptiles. And this can lead to declines in species. So in the case of reptile skins, crocodiles and alligators are commonly used to make handbags and boots and things like this. This is one of the reasons for the decline of alligators in the United States back before they were listed under the Endangered Species Act. Now that their numbers have recovered, hunting has resumed in many places, and as a result of that, you've got trade in the skins of these animals. There are also all sorts of snakes and lizards that are also used for their skins, once again, to make things like handbags and boots. But in many cases, these things are significant. Varana salvador, over 500,000 skins of Varana salvador back in 2000. Most of the snakeskin boots that you see are actually reticulated python boots. One of the primary reasons for this is that they have a reasonably attractive color pattern, but also as the longest snake on the planet, you can get a lot of skin out of a single adult specimen. All sorts of crazy stuff goes on out in nature. This is from your textbook. Once again, these are small handbags made out of the dried skins of toads. It looks like Gufo marinus, actually, which is a large enough toad that you can make a small handbag out of it. These are banjos that are skinned in snake skins for sale. I'm not exactly sure where those are for sale. And then, of course, there is exploitation of animals for things like chemical properties. So we know that a lot of amphibians have poisons and toxins that they use for anti-predator means, but those same toxins can have pharmaceutical applications. And so both for use as things like painkillers and things like this, but also in the case of snakes, there are aspects of the venom that might be useful for people with problems with blood clots and things like this. So if you have a clot and you have a toxin that is designed to break down aspects of the blood, that thing might be useful for example, dissolving clots in stroke patients and things like this. Another aspect of this is that because amphibians have these moist skins, they tend to be plagued with fungal diseases. We've already talked about chytrid fungus, but as a result, they've also evolved resistance to fungi in many cases. And so there are also substances secreted by frogs that serve as fungicides or fungal repellents that reduce the growth of fungi. And that's also a characteristic of frog skin that humans would find useful. So chemical defenses can be exploited by humans as well. And then, of course, we have amphibians and reptiles are common animals in the pet trade. And so you can go down to PetSmart and you can find animals that may or may not have been caught in the wild that are for sale in a pet store. It would be nice to think that all of those animals that are in the pet store are the result of captive breeding programs, but I am not that optimistic about that. In many cases, you can tell that they are because they are color morphs and things like this that don't occur out in nature. But for example, red ear sliders, my guess is most of the red ear sliders that you find in pet stores have actually been collected from the wild. Many states prohibit the movement of red ear sliders because people get them as pets. They get tired of them as they get older and bigger, and then they release them to the wild. So now you have a conservation problem from removing red ear sliders from their native range and decreasing populations of red ear sliders there, and then add to that the additional problem of releasing those animals into areas where they're not native, where they then either compete with native species or prey upon native species, or both. Don't buy pets at pet stores, I guess, is the main point there. And if you do get a pet from a pet store, keep it around until it dies, or you die, and then will it to someone else. Lots of people buy these tortoises, these large tortoises that originate from these Pacific islands, and they get them when they're tiny and cute, and then they grow up and they become these 350-pound monsters that like eat your furniture and ram holes in the walls of your house. And then you don't want the animal anymore because it's basically making your life a living hell. And then you're looking to get rid of the tortoise. So there's a organization out in California called American Tortoise Rescue, and they basically specialize in rehabilitating and in some cases rehoming these tortoises that people got when they were babies and they were cute, and then they grew to the point that the people really couldn't handle them. And so yeah. Amphibians and reptiles as pets can be problematic for a variety of reasons. So those are all the challenges. There are a number of examples in your book of solutions to these things. So for example, sea turtles were declining back in the 1970s and 80s because they were constantly being caught in fishing nets. And one of the things that conservationists did was they designed a better fish net design that included a thing called a turtle excluder device, which was just this set of bars that went across the mouth of the net that allowed fish to go into the net, but something as big as a turtle would be caught by those things and then directed out of a hole in the side of the net to allow the turtle to escape. And so, even though it seems depressing to talk about conservation, there are gains that have been made. We've already mentioned a couple of times now. A ban on hunting of alligators for a period of time led to those populations bouncing back relatively quickly, to the point now that there are enough alligators around that hunting has been reinstated in a number of places in their native range. So not all is depressing. There are successes. Your book also talks about a couple of cases where frog species that have gone extinct have become de-extinct because with the rise in our ability to do things molecularly, people have been able to go into museums, collect the DNA from museum specimens, basically put that DNA into the eggs of another frog that has had its DNA removed from it, and then have fostered those eggs in surrogate species and basically brought a couple of species of frogs back from extinction by essentially pulling a Jurassic Park kind of number on them. So there is hope, but once again, now you have this frog that went extinct primarily because we're talking about one of the gastric breeding toads in this case, that went extinct largely because of land use, land change. You have to ask yourself, well, what's the point of bringing that organism back from extinction using molecular biology techniques if there's no place for that species to go and live in the wild ultimately anyway, because their habitat has been destroyed. So, and on that amazingly cheery note, we're done. Questions? You guys still there?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Tomorrow we are going to go to some ponds that, or at least one pond that borders the old golf course that the school owns. In terms of land use, land change, that golf course is no longer being used as a golf course. But there are a series of ephemeral pools that border the golf course. One that we're going to tomorrow borders one of the, just down the hill from one of the old greens. and it's right next to a stream, but there are also other ephemeral pools that are not associated with the stream that occur. There's one at the end of the fairway on what used to be hole 5. When we talk about land use change, that land use is changing. It used to be, probably a mixture of forest and prairie. Then it got converted into a golf course. My guess is that what the school is probably going to do now that that is no longer a functioning golf course is they will probably eventually sell it to a developer. When a developer comes in, the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to terrascape that area. They're going to grade it in a way that makes it useful for putting in a housing development. And when they're doing that, they're going to remove all of the vegetation off of the surface of the landscape. And there are going to be erosion issues because these ephemeral pools lie in low-lying areas. All of that sediment that runs off of the newly exposed soil as a result of development is going to go into those ephemeral pools, and those ephemeral pools will fill up with sediment, and they will not be suitable for amphibian reproduction any longer. And these are ephemeral pools, which means that they dry out during the summer. As a result, they're fishless pools, and so they're an important habitat for amphibians that if they go and breed in a pond or a stream or something like that that has fish, chances are their eggs and offspring are going to be consumed by fish, thus reducing their reproductive output. And so these ephemeral pools that remain fishless because they do dry up during the summer are crucial habitats, and I'm sure that they won't be around for me to take herpetology students to in the probably relatively near future. So we will go and visit at least one of these tomorrow. We would visit more, but unfortunately, it's a pretty far walk from one of them to the next one. So we may just have time for one. We will collect frogs there so that you can have your frogs, and then we will come back to lab early enough that I can show you how to preserve them appropriately. So meet in lab at 10:45 and come prepared to get wet and muddy, most likely. All right, I will see you guys tomorrow.